So I have these two books. I think this was the last book.
Yes, Hindu Dharma and the Culture Wars.
Wars. A lot of subject matter was covered, but we'll start with this one. Who is a Hindu?
Mm-hmm.
So there is a lot of confusion, especially among the Hindus, of course. So who is a Hindu? They find it very hard to define. There is a concept of neti. So neither that nor that. So they reject what they are not, right? And then they reach whatever is left. Then that is Hinduism.
But that is correct. That is the historical definition.
Okay.
You see, the word Hindu originally is simply the Persian pronunciation of Sindhu. Sindhu, which is the Indus River. And so, and Indus, of course, is only the Greek pronunciation of, again, the same word, taken from Persian and then again adapted to Greek phonetics. So, it simply means people living on or beyond the Indus River. So, effectively, it means Indians. But that's the original definition. Mind you, before RSS chief Mohan Bhagwat started saying, oh no, it's synonymous with Indian. Well, it used to be synonymous with Indian, and that in the mouth of Iranians. It was also taken over in Arabic, colloquially pronounced Hind, but so it was interpreted as the nominative case of root Hind, because the nominative case ends in U, like Allahu Akbar. See? So, so they the formal word in formal Arabic is Hindu, but it's pronounced Hind, and that is then brought back in India as Jai Hind, for example.
True.
Anyway, so that was just a geographical term. But then, when the Muslim invasions of India started, this word Hindu, Indian, got the specific meaning of an Indian who is not a Muslim. And so automatically this includes all possible varieties of Indian religiosity. When the Parsis, the Zoroastrians, came to India, that's a special case, not because their religion is any closer to Islam, but because they were not Indians. And even in India, they retained their ethnic separateness. They're also recognizable on sight. So there you could say that they are not Indians, they're Iranians. In fact, in South Africa, in Mahatma Gandhi's time, Indian Muslims were referred to as Arabs and Indian Zoroastrians as Iranians.
Is it?
Rather than Indians, yes. So that's a bit of a special case, but everyone else, Buddhists, Brahmins, tribals, even sects that didn't exist yet at the time of the first Muslim invasions, like Sikhs, like Veerasaivas, like the Ramakrishna mission, like the Arya Samaj, and so automatically all of them are Hindus. The so-called Hindus in name only, Hindu-born secularists and so on, as long as they do not convert to Islam or Christianity, they are Hindus. And so that's not a loose kind of definition. No, that is the historical definition.
But what would be, for instance, a religious definition of Hindus?
Nothing.
It's not possible.
Well, it would be another concept than the concept of Hindu. You see, some people complain it's negatively defined, but that's the good thing about it. You see, Christianity or Islam are defined around a doctrine. And so when there are variations in that doctrine, each of these variations could also become the sort of backbone of something called a religion, like you can say the Protestant religion versus the Catholic religion. Then within Protestantism, you can say the Methodist religion, the Anglican religion, and so on. But so that's the Christian definition of religion. A religion, it's a countable word. A religion means the unit, the community grown around one specific doctrine. Now, that's not the case with Hinduism. So Hinduism is purely negatively defined, and correctly so. It means simply an Indian who is not an adherent of one of these doctrinal religions.
Now, this raises a question that every sect that comes into the picture after Muslim invasion, for example, whether it is Sikhism or even Arya Samajis and many other sects, so they try to separate themselves from this mainstream, Sanatana Dharma. They say we are not Hindus. And it's not because of course we know that there are certain provisions in the constitution that incentivize you to be a minority, to classify yourself as a minority. As we saw with the Lingayats, they tried to be minorities, that we are not Hindus. So they try to take advantage of those constitutional provisions, especially in the education sector. But even if that is removed, even before that, there is a movement that the kind of separatism, that mindset is there, that we have to be separate from them. So how do you explain that, and how to overcome that challenge? You cannot say, "Arey, you are Hindus whether you accept it or not."
Well, first of all, before they start saying we are not Hindus, there is also a stage when they start saying we are Hindus. Because you see, the concept of Hindu is not a Hindu concept. And so most Hindus didn't call themselves that. You see, if you ask them, what are you, they would either use their geographical description, their caste identity, their sampradaya identity, but not Hindu. And so Hindus as a whole, that only becomes an important concept when there is a living experience of confrontation with non-Hindus, namely Muslims, Christians, more marginally. And so that word Hindu only catches on very slowly. It starts with communities that are in direct confrontation with Islam. Like, for example, the Vijayanagar Empire that was founded by reconverts from Islam. Hindus have been forced into Islam who came back, but so they were familiar with Islam. They called themselves something like Hindu Raya Surat Rana. So the word Surat Rana is from the word sultan, right? So that's an Islamic term they take over. And so the word Hindu that goes with it is also taken over. Hindus did not naturally call themselves Hindu. That was an Islamic term. So there you see it gradually catches on. Shivaji, whose father was a mercenary for the Mughal army, also quite familiar with Islam, starts also to use the word Hindu. He was striving for Hindu Padashahi, Hindu sovereignty. So and then it's under the British with the census operations that the term really catches on. That Hindus start calling themselves Hindu. That all the time there is talk of separate Muslim electorates because they want to be separate from the Hindus and so on. So this becomes a normal term in newspapers and so on, and so everybody starts using it. Among those who use it are Guru Tegh Bahadur, Guru Govind Singh, and so on, who do refer to themselves as Hindus, not as non-Hindus. They didn't say Hum Hindu Nahi. On the contrary. So, like Govind Singh says that this Khalsa is formed precisely to defend the glory of Hindu civilization.
Even Dayanand Saraswati, he was trying to be the purest of the pure, go back to the Vedas.
Well,
he was saying, I am the original one,
well,
in a sense.
Yes, you see, there he makes a mistake that some other Hindus also make, namely to identify Hinduism with the Vedic tradition. Now, there are two stages in this. There are many Hindus who say, Hinduism starts with the Vedas. This is not true. First of all, Hinduism, even if not the word, but Hinduism is older than the Vedas. You see, Hinduism means some kind of religiosity which existed all over the world, which was undefined, which was open-ended. And so that was a landscape, and sometimes people were attracted to some interesting preacher, and then he died or he converted. Well, the concept of conversion was not there yet, but he went into something else.
Became his follower.
And all kinds of things happened, and this was moving, and there was nobody strictly defined as one sect or another. So that was the case with pre-Vedic India. So there was religiosity, there was religion, but there was not a religion, not something around a specific doctrine. Now, in this landscape, something interesting happened, namely in the Paurava tribe, the descendants of Puru, mentioned in the king lists in the Puranas. So Puru was a prince of the lunar dynasty, originated in what is now Prayag. So they moved west to the Saraswati basin in Haryana, and then so many generations later, King Yayati had 5 sons, and so they were the progenitors, so to speak, of the 5 tribes. So the central one among them was the Paurava tribe. And so within that tribe, you get a dynasty of King Bharata. And so he and his court priest Bharadwaj start the Vedic tradition. So it's with Bharadwaj that the first hymns are written. Of course, hymns had been written before. And so you can see in the Vedas, this is a very developed poetic tradition. So certainly much went before. But you see, this was the day of oral culture, and so things get lost also, and they're not preserved. And in the Vedic age too, they are not preserved on paper. There was probably no writing yet, at least nothing preserved, but it was learned by heart. So from then on, this tradition starts. Then you get more rishis, families of rishis, who compose these hymns. And so that remains within the Paurava tribe at that time. Then later it gains a lot of prestige. It becomes the backbone of a number of new sciences, starting with phonetics, grammar, then astronomy for determining the time of certain ceremonies and so on, ritualism. And then you get the Upavedas, the other sciences are associated with it, medicine, mathematics, and so on. So this becomes a very prestigious tradition, and everybody wants to be part of it. So they don't need to do much conquering. There's a little conquering in the northwest. So Punjab was not originally their territory. So they expanded a little. But in most of India, they Vedicized themselves. And so by that time, there were specialists. Initially, there were none. There is no such thing as the caste system in the Rig Veda. But so gradually, you get specialists named Brahmins. And so they are invited to Bengal. They are invited to South India. They are given lands to build agraharas, villages of their own, and so on. And so that way, gradually, most of India is Vedicized. But you see, that becomes the prestigious tradition, the normative tradition, the one through which everything else is mapped out. Everything is given a place through this Vedic tradition and its language, Sanskrit. So you see, that becomes the normative language for every religious tradition. Now, there were other religious traditions. And so from our vantage point today, we can more or less locate them geographically, like the tradition of meditation, of the belief in reincarnation to start with, seems to be originating in the Northeast, in Bihar. Then you have the mother goddess cult, which exists in every village, but is mostly centralized in Bengal, Assam. You have the tradition that you find everywhere in today's India of murti worship in temples, and so on. So you have
So
different.
that also came after the Vedas.
Not necessarily. I mean, of course, what we can
Because
see.
there is a huge debate whether the Murti Puja is in Vedas or not.
Yeah, well, on the side of it, no. You see, in the Harappan cities, for example, we find no temples. We would have had far more physical remains if they had really done that. I mean, if you compare with Mesopotamia. But I mean, it might be. You see, in some corners of India, it may have been there. Nothing against it. And you know, the question, it already exists in the Vedas or not, already starts from the bias that Hinduism all started from the Vedas. Well, it did not. You see, the Vedas became the primus inter pares, the first among equals, became the leading tradition. Nevertheless, it was not the only one. It was never the only one. In fact, in some circles of Vedic scholars, you still have a certain distancing from, even a certain contempt for what is now most commonly seen as Hinduism, namely worship in temples. You see, historically, Brahmins took the job because, well, it was a fixed income.
But
And people wanted Brahmins to do it because they wanted somebody pure. They wanted the rituals to be strong and therefore to be conducted by people deemed pure. So they wanted Brahmins there. And so many Brahmins did that, but there is a category of Brahmins that has always looked down on this. You see that the pure continuation of the Vedic tradition was for them enough. So you have a number of traditions coexisting. They all together form what is now known as Hinduism. But so they cannot be reduced to the Vedas. And it is important to see that, you see nowadays, everybody, what you see most of Hinduism is not the Vedas. Most people have never read the Vedas. But is the epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, they are all over the place. Like some of the great festivals are taken from the epics, like Diwali that we just had. But so there's an era when the epics were not known, when children were not baptized Rama or Krishna. There was, even going back farther, there was an age before the Vedas. And that those were also Hindus. You know, by the definition I already gave, you know, they were not Muslims, they were not Christians.
So
7,000 years ago,
was,
but they were Hindus.
Before, we can say that the mature Harappan stage, we can say that was before Vedas were written.
Not necessarily. You see, there is an argument, you find it in K.D. Setna's book Karpasa, about cotton. Cotton not being mentioned in the Rig Veda, but being very much present in the Harappan city. So he draws from that a conclusion, the Rig Veda must be pre-Harappan. Right? So the chronology of the Veda, that is a contentious issue.
Vedas, how they became prominent? Like, what is your reasoning? Why would they have become so prominent? First among equals, as you said.
Well, because they were impressive. You see, apart even from all the sciences that were formed around it. Like, you see, linguistics. This is a totally Indian invention. You see, modern linguistics came about thanks to the discovery of Sanskrit in the West. And so, you see, of course, that was prestigious for people somewhat in the know, somewhat inclined to education. But you see, the hymns themselves were very impressive. You see, this tradition of people learning this by heart with all thmnemotechnical rules to preserve the texts perfectly, so that if you hear the Vedas recited today, it is effectively, as Indologist Michael Witzel has said, a tape recording from thousands of years ago. You see, the first recitation of that particular hymn, if you hear that repeated today, that's exactly the same. The whole transmission is precisely geared to the preservation of every detail of this recitation. And so that's very prestigious, you know. This is very important in the preservation of religion. Like, for instance, why today? Perhaps an unexpected comparison. Why today it is difficult to convert people out of Islam. Now you see, you may say, yeah, this is because people are afraid, because there are reprisals against apostates.
These are the common answers.
Yeah, that's part of the story. But you see, people who have learned the Quran by heart, and this whole system of rules and so on, they take a certain pride in what they've learned. And so that's a general human tendency, that people are attached to what they've learned. And so when they find out later, or when they are told, oh, all this was a mistake, well, that's
too late.
That's a very serious slight on their self-esteem, right? And so similarly with the Vedas, regardless of what it says, regardless of what is in there, people stood in awe of it because of the enormous effort, discipline, knowledge that had gone into it.
So they are so impressive. And at one time, Hindus were so, for example, Vedic people were so impressive and so awe-inspiring, so inspiring. So they attracted people.
Yeah.
And now, once all these invasions started, especially after 11th century, 12th century, so then you see people start to see Hindu or the Sanatan Dharma as weak, and they start to weasel out of it somehow. So it is only a question of being powerful, being attractive, or is it something more than that?
Well, that is a large part of it. Of course, when today, for instance, many Westerners are attracted to India, it's not a reason of power or of money.
Exactly.
See, those for them are not involved. It's really because they are attracted to what the Vedic or any other Hindu tradition presents. Like, for instance, Hindu music, well, there's nothing like it. You know, Carnatic music, you know, this is unparalleled. And so people are simply attracted for the beauty, for the quality of that. So that also exists. But you see, in social context, there are other factors like prestige and so on that are attached to it. You know. So you derive your self-esteem and so on by being a master within that tradition.
And as you said, for example, a Muslim is very hard to convert, or for example, conservative Christian, they're very hard to convert. They tend to be fanatics, zealots, so to speak. And because Hindus, at least we saw so many of them, they tend, due to parenting or whatever, schooling, they tend to be by default secularists or atheists. So they don't care, they don't read Vedas for sure. Even they have not read the epics, Mahabharata and Ramayana in original. They may have seen the episodes on TV, but they haven't read the original. So do you think there is a huge and major reason for that deracination and their proclivity to convert? For example, we see so many issues associated with that, whether it is so-called love jihad, or whether it is conversion, which is a big concern. So all these issues, do they start at parenting level?
Well, let's start at the beginning. In the British period, the minimizing, downplaying of Hinduism is in full swing. And you see many Hindus trying to be somehow non-Hindu or less Hindu. Like you mentioned, the Arya Samaj. The Arya Samaj strongly models Hinduism after the example of Protestantism. Like they try to say, oh, we are monotheistic. You know, you have like translations from the Vedas where every name of a deity, you know, Agni, Varuna, and so on, is always translated as God. God this, God that, just as if it is the Bible speaking.
And break the stranglehold of priestly class, just as the
Protestants are against the papacy. Yes, of course. Then they are against idols. And so initially, this is to become more respectable. You see, they accept the Christian definition of respectability. Oh, idols are primitive. So they say, oh, no, we have nothing to do with idols. But you
The
see,
good
at
thing is-
but
the
at
good
the end
thing-
at the end of the day,
Yeah.
you see, today, you know, that phase of militantism, of defending Hinduism against Christianity, also against Islam, with reconversions from Islam and so on going on, that has all been discarded as soon as secularism came into vogue, whereas the iconoclasm, the idea that many gods and depictions of gods are somehow evil, that has remained. So, you know, at the end, this became quite a negative operation for Hinduism. And so it starts with the interiorization of a number of Christian concepts. Why? Because of awe of Christianity and disparaging of historical Hinduism.
So of course, when you see that these people are coming here and ruling over us, so they get inspired
Yes.
and awed by them. I mean, but when you see that even Westerners who actually make the effort to read about Sanatan Dharma, they are very much inspired by it, awed by it. They come, travel all the way and come here, spend years, right? As you have done for the last 3 decades.
Yeah.
So, in this whole scenario, is the answer to, I mean, the answer is straightforward, right? If you don't even read about your own religion, if you don't read the Vedas, how do you get attached to it, right? That is where the problem is. If you don't even know your traditions, how can you be inspired by it?
Yeah, the two
How can you value it?
The two are very closely related. So, strictly speaking, you don't need to, you know, be at home in Hindu scriptures, respectively Christian scriptures, Islamic scriptures. But nevertheless, that's what you do when you really are into the religion. This you can see very clearly among converts. You see, like in the West, you have converts to Islam. Strange, but nevertheless, they exist. And so what I see among them is that after a while, they really become experts on Islam. They start studying Islamic art and Islamic history and so on. And so because they attach themselves to Islam, they want to know everything about it. And
there is a saying in Hindi, naya naya mulla Allah Allah jada karta hai.
Oh,
Yeah. So the new convert is more
yes.
ferocious.
Right, but so what is important in this context is that attachment to a religion goes together with knowing about the religion, getting to know the religion in depth. And so exactly the opposite is happening today. And so people are crassly illiterate about Hinduism. About religion in general, I must say, this is partly the Marxist influence.
Are you saying about the Hindus or the general public?
Well, in the West, to some extent, you see the same. Huh? When there are discussions about Christianity, they do have some very stereotypical ideas about what Christianity is. Then that was like the generation that left the church. Like in a backward country like mine, this was in about 1970, 80. In other countries like France, it was earlier. But so that generation is practically gone. And so now you get a generation that hardly knows about Christianity anymore. And this includes those who are still Christian. And so they have all kinds of funny, sentimental ideas about Christianity. that Christianity only means turning the other cheek and so on. All the weak stuff, all the sentimental stuff.
The
But you see-
woke.
Yeah, right. And so the what really makes up Christianity, they hardly know anymore. And so you get the same thing here with Hinduism. You see, an earlier generation, drank in Hinduism. It was all around. It was just life. Whereas today, that is very distant, very different. You see, they go to school. They don't get to see anything of Hinduism anymore. They don't live with their family or rarely. And even within the family, the grandparents by now, rather than teaching the children, are watching TV, watching Bollywood movies and so on. So there's just
Which
much-
also don't have anything to do with.
Exactly. So you see, Hinduism is not really part of life anymore. That's why education is so important.
And
You
it,
see, if they don't learn it at home, make them learn it in school.
and incidentally, if you see whatever Hinduism in as lived life is found mostly in villages and even tribal areas,
Yes.
the decolonized parts of India.
Yeah.
The most colonized parts of India, for example, in cities like Delhi, Mumbai, you will find, at least the people, you will find religiosity, but most number of people will not be much bothered about Hinduism. They will not be so much involved in rituals, in religion, in reading. But they may not, even in rural areas, they may not be reading as much, but at least they are living it by default in the family settings.
Yes, but so that is also becoming less and less, because in the old days, villages looked after themselves. Today, in all villages, you also have TVs and internet and so on. So they become far more influenced by city life and by the trends over here. So even there, you see, Hinduism is disappearing.
Do you think in the West, for example, we see so many atheists coming up? You talked about how in your own country, Christian people have become all this soft stuff they are being brought up with, becoming woke and all. Do you think it has something to do with the whole secularization of life that started with the Protestant Revolution?
Yeah, well, wait a minute. You see, here secularism is being used in different senses, even within one sentence. You see, Protestantism has this to do with secularism, that it was an acceptance of pluralism within Christianity. You see, in Catholicism, there is one teaching, the doctrinal authority of Rome, and everybody has to follow that. Whereas in Protestantism, everybody is free to read scriptures and interpret them in his own way. So there it is legitimate that there are different interpretations existing side by side. And so when they're like solid enough, they form into a separate church. And so Belgium used to be monolithically Catholic. Holland has a wealth of different Protestant sects. And so they had to sort of live together. So there was an agreement, you see, that, okay, within our churches we have sovereignty in our own circle. And otherwise there's like the common marketplace, and there we tolerate each other, maybe respect each other. I mean, at least don't bother each other. There is no or only limited state religion. Then when minorities in England who disagreed with the Anglican Church went to America, they founded like territories of their own. You see, Massachusetts for the Puritans and Pennsylvania for the Quakers, Maryland for the Catholics, who were also a minority in England. And even those states were even allowed to have a state religion. You see, the First Amendment of the American Constitution that prohibits a state religion, that counts for the Union, all right? But so there you have a rather positive idea of secularism. You see, it's peaceful coexistence of all the different sects. And so the state does not interfere in religious matters, does not take a position in religious matters. By contrast, in France, you have a negative view of secularism. Secularism is born from a suspicion of everything to do with church. Like you get secular education, state schools, you see, where no priests are given any role. Or like in Mexico, where priests, for example, didn't even have the voting rights. Recently that was restored, but so there was an enormous suspicion of the church. So in India you get a bit a mix of the two. In law, mostly it is this Protestant variety of peaceful coexistence, equal respect for all religions. Though, of course, effectively the law is also interpreted in an anti-Hindu sense. This has to do with, you see, the French suspicion or hostility against the monolithic Catholic Church that is transplanted to India, where it doesn't apply at all. And so there is a strong desire, about which Nehru, for instance, was very explicit, to sort of contain the Hindus. The Hindus are dangerous. The rest are only minorities. The Hindus are dangerous. Now, it's a very bizarre thing. You see, when you speak about minorities in other countries, they are like groups that are afraid, that are... whereas here, Muslims and Christians have never had anything to fear from Hindus. There is no such thing as Hindu oppression of minorities. You know, I mean, some people say, yeah, you know, we need reservations, we need to do something special for our minorities. You see, I can understand in America, where nowadays race rather than in India religion is a dividing factor, that the majority of whites has a historical guilt or something vis-a-vis blacks who have been slaves, although perhaps not blacks like Obama, who come from Kenya and were slaveholders themselves historically. And they have some debt to the Native Americans, certainly, whom they massacred and drove away from their ancestral lands and so on. Now, whether the solution for that is reservations and, you know, giving sweeteners to the minorities, that can be debated. But the historical fact that whites as such have oppressed non-whites, that's simply a fact.
Yeah.
You can't get around that. Now, in the case of India, it is then automatically assumed by very many Westerners, oh yeah, and the Hindus similarly have something to compensate for vis-a-vis the minorities. Well, exactly the opposite is the case. You see, there is no time in Indian history when it was an advantage to be a Hindu rather than a Muslim. Or, you see, under the Portuguese or under the British,
least as
rather
long
than
as
a
they have
Christian.
existed. Both the communities have existed. So most of the time it's the Muslims who have ruled.
Well, I mean, if there is something to compensate, then it is the minorities who have to pay compensation to the majority.
And it's very interesting that in all these Western countries, for example, all these progressive countries, they don't have the concept of minority rights as much as we have. For example, Article 30, Article 29 gives you educational and cultural rights to set up education institutions, where your institutions, the institutions of minority, are given much more privilege. They're exempted from strict laws like Right to Education Act. So when you see those kind of discrimination, and there is a talk of giving religious reservation to all these sects, and when you compare it to America or Britain or other European countries, where whites and non-whites have already there is a historical fact that they have oppressed non-whites, not in their own countries but outside their countries also. So there is no concept of reservation, there? No concept of minority rights?
Wait a minute. I'm going to go into this only very briefly because it's not really the topic. So what happens outside India is in principle color blind, respectively religion blind. So everybody is equal before the law. Like the Belgian constitution explicitly says, all citizens are equal before the law, regardless of their race, of their religion, and so on. So that's not the case in India.
True.
That's not the case in India at all. So first of all, you have separate civil codes.
Even criminal codes are separate when you take into consideration that there is a SC/ST law.
Yeah, right.
Atrocities Act. For example, if somebody commits a crime, and if he commits one crime against, for example, SC or ST, and another, the same crime against a person from upper caste, then he will be punished more for the crime against SC/ST.
Yes.
That is a fact. So there is a different criminal code also.
Yes, yeah, right. But that's not so much inter-religion. Okay, so we can discuss that.
Yeah.
And I mean, I can say, if you care to know, that as a general principle, I am against these reservations, these special law systems. So we can consider what precisely prompted this SC/ST law. But at any rate, this should be limited, temporary, and in principle, it shouldn't be there. Even Dr. Ambedkar was for reservations only on a temporary basis.
For 10 years.
Nobody dares to implement what he at the time proposed. So anyway, as for religion, you see, for instance, that you have separate family law for Muslims or Christians. The famous example is, of course, a Muslim man is allowed 4 wives. He's allowed to just send his wife away, whereas everyone else has to pass through a judge. Well, so this is at any rate not secular. I mean, 4 years ago, I think there was a big conference in my hometown, Leuven, Belgium, about religious science. And so I gave there a paper about India's fake secularism. And so everybody thought I was going to say, oh, you see, these ugly, vicious Hindus, you see, they pretend to be secular, but in reality, the minorities are oppressed and so on. Well, I was saying just the opposite.
Yeah.
And so I was just showing that India is not a secular state. Very simple. Everybody was, what is he saying? Whereas it was all obvious, you see, I could just easily on my PowerPoint just show the letter of the law that very explicitly discriminates against the Hindus.
Yeah, it's open for everyone to see.
Yes, of course. And even where it isn't, I mean, you can say that the different law systems, family law systems between Hindus, Muslims, Christians, they're just different. They don't discriminate one against the other, but they are just different. Well, that already is non-secular.
But it's very interesting that when Nehru passed the Uniform Civil Code for Hindus only in 1950s, there was much opposition from the conservative Hindu circles. And the same conservatives, Hindu conservatives, when they transformed into Hindu Mahasabha and then into the BJP, not Hindu Mahasabha, sorry, Jan Sangh, and then into the BJP, they started championing the Uniform Civil Code for everyone.
Yes.
So earlier there were different civil codes for Hindus. Now, how do you see that? That being Hindus, obviously it's very obvious that everybody is following different traditions and their civil codes have to be different.
Yeah, well, you see, there I have to confess, I only look at it from the outside. I mean, I never have had the experience of, you see, a Hindu wedding and I mean, with all the ramifications, socially speaking and so on. So I don't know what it really meant for Hindus when this uniform civil code for Hindus was introduced in 1955,
54,
I think, thereabouts. And so I do not have any strong opinion about it, but I just noticed that there were many civil codes for Hindus.
Yes.
And in principle, like every caste had its own civil code.
Hmm.
And the final
Sampradayas
arbiter,
had
the final arbiter was not the king, was not the Shastras, was the caste panchayat.
Hmm.
And then at a higher level, the panchayat, where every caste was represented and where deals between the castes had to be made. And so, whatever demonization of caste is going on, it was first of all not being excluded from, but belonging to. You belong to a particular community with particular rights, duties, and so on, and with a particular law of its own. So that was abolished, all that was straightened out. But the point is that, you see, Hindus were not an asking party for this reform.
Yeah.
You see, Hindus didn't care about the civil code or about the uniform civil code. And so if there is now a demand for a uniform civil code, it is not so much a Hindu demand, it's a demand of secularism. Every secularist worth the name must be clamoring for a common civil code.
But what I am asking is, for example, given what Hinduism is, what Hindus are by nature, there's so many divisions, right? So many different ways of life within Hinduism itself. So how do you see that, combining everyone under one kind of law, uniform civil code? Like, what is the problem with everyone having, every sampradaya, every area, maybe other areas having their different codes?
Well, I must say I haven't really thought that through.
Isn't that more in consonance with Hinduism?
Yeah, true. But as a modern person, I'm comfortable with the idea of the same law for everyone. It's what exists in my country. And I see nothing wrong with it. I see these people on internet forums protesting and so on, but it's all only words, There is no political party really giving an alternative for that, or going back to the Shastras or so. Long ago, there was the Ram Rajya Parishad of Swami Karpatri. That was a really traditionalist party, but it plays no role anymore.
I think it's just an intellectual exercise, maybe.
Yeah, and many people claim we need a Hindu Rashtra. Usually they don't even know what that means, a Hindu Rashtra. Shivaji didn't have a Hindu Rashtra. But you see, that's only a name that, by the way, would antagonize everyone. I mean, very many people, including many Hindus. So you certainly win a lot of enemies with that, whereas I do not see any benefits that you would gain from this word Hindu Rashtra. But at any rate, you see, all those people are effectively used to the modern law system of the Constitution, give or take a few things that are really up for criticism in there, but nevertheless, the whole concept of a modern law system, they ask no questions about this.
But when you look at, for example, civil codes of Western countries,
yes,
where are they inspired from? Are they rooted in Christianity or the Christian values or the Christian civilization?
No, they're rooted in Roman law. And in fact, canon law, the law within the church, is entirely modeled on Roman law. And so the church did not really have a law system of its own. This is another factor, if you want to know about secularism, this is another important historical factor in the creation of secularism, namely that Christianity itself was secular from the beginning. You see, Islam, when it came about, very soon Muhammad found himself in power. He wanted to set up a state with a specific law system, the Sharia. Whereas Christians were a nervous little minority in that big imposing Roman Empire, they had to adapt to the law of the land. And so in Christianity from the beginning, this idea is there. Well, there is the temporal authority, with the Roman law. And then there is the spiritual authority, the church, of which the authority was limited. So in all kinds of secular matters, criminal matters, and so on, it was the state that decided. And so the church impinged rather far upon temporal power in the Middle Ages, the Holy Roman Empire. But that was temporary. And then when secularization came about, the church did not find it really very difficult to adapt. Because secularism is inherent in Christianity.
But certainly today's uniform civil codes must have something Christian about them. I mean, even if there is nothing Christian, you said they are secular by nature, by origin.
Yeah.
So they are quite comfortable with that tradition.
Well, at
as
least
compared to, say, Hindus.
The idea of separation of church and state is very much there. But so church for them means the embodiment of a doctrine. Whereas in Hinduism, that's not really there. There are, of course, a number of customs that are quite plural, like in the Shastras, you find 8 different types of marriage.
Yeah.
So that pluralistic outlook is already there from the beginning in Hinduism. But, there was no concern about separation between religion and state, simply because religion was not seen as a threat. Religion was just there, and it didn't threaten anybody who did not believe it, even if the concept of belief applies at all.
Yeah, that's why the whole the alarm that people raise, secularists raise about Hinduism impacting the state, the fears that it would have something similar impact that church had on those states at that time. So I think that is completely an imported idea.
Well, you see, as I show in my book about Hindu Dharma and the Culture Wars, a very interesting case study is the ethical questions. You have the question of abortion, where Hinduism in the state laws plays no role at all. You see, in the Shastras, well, again, you can't limit Hinduism to the Shastras. Okay, but you see, one document that already the British went by is the Manu Smriti and related Shastras. And so what we find there is a strict prohibition of abortion. And in about 1996, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad came out with the document, the Hindu Agenda, 40-point Hindu Agenda, which they proposed to each of the political parties. And so one of the points there was prohibition on abortion. So you don't hear much about it. You hear a lot about the Ayodhya temple and so on, but this you don't hear about. So strictly speaking, a Hindu state would prohibit abortion. Now, whether that is right or wrong, at any rate, that's the Hindu thing to do. Or that's the Vedic thing, the Shastric thing to do. At any rate, it should be important in Hindu life. And so you don't hear about it at all. Perhaps because in the 60s, 70s, everybody was so aware of the enormous overpopulation problem that they accepted just every way to limit the population.
That's another aspect of Sanatan Dharma, why it is Sanatan, because it changes itself, molds itself according to the times and needs of the generations. Right.
Okay, but then you see 2 other points of ethical legislation, and in both of them something similar has happened that is quite interesting to notice. And that has really very little to do with pressure from Hindus. You see, I mean, I don't know what it is with Hindus. Often, or well, sometimes, they have it their way, not because of their own effort. You see, they bloody don't deserve the victories they get. But so maybe it is because of all these yajnas and pujas and so on that they somehow
Good karma.
affect the gods who then rain down some benefits. Uh, at any rate, the laws about euthanasia or assisted death, voluntary death, and homosexuality. You see, on homosexuality, Hinduism hardly legislates at all. It's like a policy of don't ask, don't tell. And so mostly it's not mentioned at all, it's not made an issue in the Shastras and so on. I think there is one law, for example, where it is said that a woman who commits adultery has to be punished, has to be fined. It's not stoned or anything. It's quite reasonable. But, and then it says explicitly whether with a man or a woman, whether it is hetero or lesbian, you see, and that makes no difference. She's never punished because of a lesbian act. She's only punished because it is adulterous. So Hinduism has a fairly relaxed attitude to this without sanctifying it. There's no, among these 8 systems of marriage, there's no gay marriage as they nowadays clamor for. But so it has a totally, more positive attitude than Islam or Christianity have. There's no stoning or throwing from high buildings and so on like you have in Afghanistan. And there's also no imprisoning like they did with Oscar Wilde or Alan Turing or so. But without saying, okay, this is normal, this gets the full institutional recognition that the heterosexual marriage get. So this is the Hindu situation. You can of course argue whether this is good or bad, but it is totally different from what existed in England in the colonial period. Therefore, in the 19th century, the British introduced a law prohibiting and giving the usual punishments to sodomy.
There was a whole process of Victorian morality being thrust upon India.
Right, and so the same thing with euthanasia. You see, in India, of course, ideally there is a practice among yogis that they simply can voluntarily, when they feel their time has come, they can just voluntarily go.
There's a whole culture of samadhi.
Right, so that's, let's say, only for very advanced yogis. But there is a whole culture of fasting to death. And like in the modern age, we see that Vinayak Damodar Savarkar or Vinoba Bhave, the Gandhian, have effectively fasted unto death.
Yeah.
And so when Vinoba Bhave was lying on his deathbed, he was visited by Indira Gandhi as the prime minister. And so the secularists in the papers were indignant, Oh, this man should not have received the visit from the prime minister. He should have been imprisoned. He was breaking the law of the land. Well, I think that's vicious, you see. A dying person subjected to this. But more important here from a legislative viewpoint, this was not the law of the land in the sense of something emanating from the population itself. This had been imposed by the British. This was a colonial law par excellence. Now, both the laws against homosexuality and against euthanasia have effectively been discontinued by decisions of the Supreme Court only 5 or so years ago. So effectively, these laws have not been voted on, but effectively they stand annulled. And so you get a return to the more relaxed situation in Hindu society.
Going back to the original question about who are Hindus, and you described like neti neti. So the question comes of that this is the reason why we are not united. This is the reason there is a lack of unity, and this is the reason why we get defeated time and time again. So this there is so much because of there is no defined outline of Hinduism and who is a Hindu. So everybody is doing their own thing, while only defining against, for example, Islam, or when it comes to Islam or Christianity, they come together as Hindus, as voting bloc. But if that factor is not there, then everybody withers away. So how do you see this lack of unity clamor?
Right. Well, first of all, I am a bit skeptical of the idea of unity. And the RSS is always talking about unity. We need unity.
Yeah.
You see,
For what?
As I have seen it function, their demand for unity simply means don't criticize the RSS. So, you see, I think talk of unity, that's something for Islam, Tawheed. And it is not fitting for a pluralistic outlook that is typical of Hinduism. You can have unity because at some point you have a common enemy. Then you have to stand together. Like famously in the Battle of Bahraich in 1033. So the Islamic aggressor Salar Masud Ghaznavi, the nephew of Mahmud Ghaznavi, was going from strength to strength, conquering Ayodhya, for example. Very probably being the first who destroyed the Janmabhoomi temple, which was then rebuilt, and that's then the big temple of which the archaeologists have dug up the foundations. So the Hindu kings felt the need, we have to stop this. And so they got together under the leadership of Suheldev, and including the philosopher king Raja Bhoja, and they defeated.
Is Suheldev's story historical or folk tale?
Absolutely. Of course, now a historical novel has been made of it.
But is that non-fiction or fiction?
Well, that's a historical novel. That means that
fiction.
Certain historical facts are then colored, are filled in.
So that's typical way of telling history in India, right?
Well, in the sense that it's not there in the school books, so it's open for someone to do something for it. I understand. I hear that there's talk about the film rights, that a film is going to be made about it, which I welcome, because that's a way to make this theme alive among the common people.
I mean, in India, what I meant to say was that stories are more important than whether they actually happened or not. That is a secondary consideration.
Yeah.
Even with Mahabharata and Ramayana, so you get the lessons on dharma and so many things. So you take that first. Worry about the dates and other things later.
Yeah. Well, you see, that's true. You see, and people can have stories as much as they want. As a historian, I'm interested in whether they really happened or not. Yeah. So the Battle of Bahraich is very much historical.
Yes.
As for the Mahabharata, well, that was written, over a considerable period of time, adding more and more embellished versions, then inserting philosophical discourses.
It changes with times also, right?
Well, but the core story is essentially historical. Krishna was a historical figure.
Yes.
See, and here, of course, I see secularism. Oh, this stupid, superstitious Dr. Elst actually says that he was a historical character. Well, yes, of course he was a historical character. But you see, whether he lived through what is described, now that's a different matter. Rama was definitely a king of the Solar dynasty based in Ayodhya. Maybe his wife really was abducted. This is an event that happens a lot in history. Like Helen of Troy in the Iliad, same story. Or like, for instance, the wife of Genghis Khan was abducted and then later recovered. This is real history. But then you see whether Hanuman jumped so many yojanas to this island where she was, and so on. Now, that I will not vouch for. Okay? But so essentially, that's historical. The Battle of Bahraich does not even, present these problems. The battle was simply historical.
So we come to the unity question.
Yes, okay.
Yes.
But so that's a case where there was ad hoc unity. So Hindus can perfectly be divided and so on. That's all very fine. But you see, the law system has to give a certain measure of unity, namely that the same rights, the same duties count for the same kind of people. And so there you have to have unity for all Indian citizens, Muslims, Christians, and so on as well. Then among Hindus themselves, well, you see, the laws should not be different for Hindus and for others, but among Hindus, as long as there is such a category, there should be more consciousness of what they have in common.
Yes.
And so that's right now a problem. That's also an element in the fragmentation of Hinduism. You see, all these people who say we are not Hindus, I'm Hindu nahi, they show an enormous illiteracy, both about Hinduism in general and also about their own tradition. Like Khalistanis who say that the Hindus, the gurus were already against Hinduism. Not a total nonsense. They were 100% Hindu. But you see, by now they have, written fantasy history to this extent that is what they really believe. But so in the case, the Sikhs is a special case because there the British were a great factor. It's the British who created the separate Sikh identity. Whereas what of course now plays extra in the Sikh case, but plays exclusively in the case of the Veerasaivas, the Ramakrishna mission and so on, is essentially this contempt for Hinduism. Okay, there is a direct reason, namely the legal discriminations against Hinduism that they want to escape by claiming minority status. Like in the case of the Ramakrishna mission, its defenders always say, yeah, but what could they do? Well, I'll tell you what they could do. They could have appealed to Hindu society. They could have said, okay, what is happening to us now can happen to any of you tomorrow. Yes. So let's stand together as Hindus and change the law and make it more equal and stop the discriminations against Hinduism. That is perfectly what they could have done. Instead, they desolidarized themselves from the rest of the Hindus. Like the rats leaving the sinking ship. They see Hinduism as a sinking ship, and therefore they left. And so the same thing with the Veerasaivas, for example. So you see this emphasis on we are not Hindus. It's very illiterate. They just don't know what words they are using. Like the word Hindu. What does the word Hindu mean? It has a very clear historical meaning, confirmed moreover by Veer Savarkar in his Hindutva book, but confirmed also, and rather more importantly, by the constitution, by the Hindu code in 1955 that we talked about. It defines exactly to whom does it apply.
Yes.
And so it applies to every Indian except Muslims, Christians, Parsis.
It's very interesting that when Hindu code was formulated, it was applied to Hindus, and Hindu ka definition tha Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Jains.
Yeah.
And then we moved to 1990s where the minority commission comes, where the minorities are defined as 5 religious minorities, and then the 6th Jains are added in 2014. So there is a complete reversal from a Hindu identity, legal identity, to a non-minority. So basically, except Hindus, everybody is a minority in this country,
which was made possible by the disparaging of Hinduism.
Exactly.
You see, what is needed here is to tell the true story. As I said, the Vedic tradition has, brought around it a number of sciences that did great things. Like in mathematics, for instance, India played an enormous pioneering role. And you ought to be proud of that,
So people don't even know. That's what we were talking, right? People, if people don't even know about it, how can they be proud of it?
Yeah, right.
Right. So, and how can you tell the other guy? How can you convince the other guy when you are yourself are in the dark?
But so right now, Hinduism is caste.
Yes.
Nothing but caste, only caste. Whereas if you see the whole picture of Hindu history as including a correct history of caste, because that also, of course, is usually manipulated,
Yeah.
then you have something to be proud of. Then the Sikhs are going to say, we are Hindus. We are the best Hindus. You know?
Yes.
So it's very important to tell the true story, which is a source of pride. You see, I don't say, you have to be proud. Like you see some people, for instance, demand, Indian history should be written by patriotic historians. No, I don't like that concept of patriotic historians. You just need true history. And if there's something painful to be told, well, sorry, but then you have to face that.
Yeah.
But so on the whole, the history is quite glorious.
And we were talking about unity. For example, we saw the most glorious example of unity during the Ayodhya movement, right? When there is a cause to fight for, then people will get united. And when there is no cause, then you can't expect unity for the unity purpose, right?
Yes. Now, having been closely associated with the Ayodhya movement, I still evolve in my thinking about it. You see, sometime after the Kothari brothers from Bengal had been shot by the police of Mulayam Singh Yadav, 1990 or 91, thereabouts. Shortly after that, I visited their family. And I mean, of course, I expressed my condolence and my sympathy and so on. But you see, I came away with the idea, but could this not have been avoided? Now, of course, Mulayam Singh Yadav could have behaved differently. But you see, could the Ayodhya movement itself not have been conducted differently? Once in a while, you see, straight confrontation is inevitable. Well, was this the case here? You see, when you study the years before the Great Confrontation, then I have the impression that this could really be avoided. You see, in the 1980s, the Rajiv Gandhi government was not at all against Ayodhya, against the temple. You see, today you have the impression that Congress is anti-Hindu.
It was Rajiv who opened the locks.
Yeah, well, it was the court under Rajiv.
Yeah.
But Rajiv himself also did a lot, to make it possible.
Yeah.
And so his concessions to the Muslim leadership, while reprehensible from a secularist viewpoint, like the Shah Bano judgment or the law against to overrule the judgment, or the banning of the Satanic Verses book, while I don't condone them in themselves, nevertheless, they were part of a larger plan, of a larger compromise, a typical case of Congress-side horse trading, where the Muslim leadership would give them some sweeteners to make them accept the Hindu temple for the Hindus.
Yeah.
And so there was the presence of Home Minister Bhutta Singh at the Shilanyas, the first stone laying in 1989. And there was even talk of Rajiv Gandhi himself laying the first stone. So he was not at all against this. And so I wonder, you see, if the Hindutva movement could not have strategized in such a way that they, you see, took this opportunity, cooperated with Congress, and got the temple built without any bloodshed.
I think there the appeasement came into the picture and he developed cold feet.
Well, one event that played a big role, and this is one that perhaps as a historian I tend to overestimate in importance, but you see, it's the role of historians. Also in 1989, you got this statement, the political abuse of history, Babri Masjid Ram Janmabhoomi, by the JNU historians, or as they have become known since, the Eminent historians.
Thanks to Arun Shourie.
And so that Well, especially thanks to themselves, because they always praised one another, so they called one another eminent historians.
Even in the news reports,
Yes.
the eminent historian
But
quoted.
so, you see, they consecrated the Babri Masjid as the Mecca of secularism. This was the absolute bulwark to defend against the rising tide of the Hindu hordes. And so for politicians, including Congress ones, it became difficult to defend the temple after this.
Yeah.
And so that also played a role. And in fact, it is that statement that created the Ayodhya controversy. Initially, some Muslims, of course, were against it. But you see, as Congress, with a lot of experience in horse trading, estimated, you see, this could be bought off. But so the secularists themselves had really nothing to say. I mean, they were against it, but it was very obvious that there had been a temple there. So, you can still argue about, okay, should this temple be rebuilt or not? But that there had been a temple was obvious. In 1885, there had been a trial where all parties concerned, including the local Muslims, including the British judges, all agreed, yes, there had been a temple there, yes, it was demolished.
That battle has been conclusively won now.
Yes, but the important thing here is that, you see, there was no Ayodhya issue. You see, everybody knew the history. Then Rajiv Gandhi and later also Narasimha Rao said, a very cunning Congressite way of formulating, that the decision about whether there should be a temple or not should be based on the history, whether there was a temple or not. Which is coded language for saying, yes, of course there should be a temple, because both Rajiv and Narasimha Rao knew perfectly well that there had been a temple there, that there was evidence for it, that, you see, after the scholars debate about the evidence, even more evidence was dug up. In fact, even after the court case was closed, even more evidence has seen the light. Yeah. So of course, of course, there had been a temple there. Yeah. And so, you see, this JNU statement that, there had never been a temple there, that it was all Hindu concoction, that has really caused a lot of bloodshed.
What do you think about the, given that experience, what do you think the case of Mathura and Kashi, where is that headed?
Yeah, well, in the case of Ayodhya, at least a controversy had been created. Now, the complete loss of faith of the secularists in that regard, where, you see, they could not bring up any arguments at all, where they were completely powerless before the rising tide of evidence, where, you see, they went to court in the Uttar Pradesh High Court and, on the witness stand, and were asked, okay, what is this famous expertise of yours that says there was no temple there? And so one after another, as Meenakshi Jain has documented, had to, say, oh, but I'm not an archaeologist, I've never been to Ayodhya. I've only signed because all my colleagues were signing. And so, that famous expertise that all the foreign scholars, for instance, relied on, why they hounded me out of everywhere, that turned out to be nothing. That turned out to be just bluff. And so after that, you see, they will not do this again in Mathura and Kashi. Where,
do you think so? I think they're pretty shameless.
Where, you see, unlike the artificial controversy about Ayodhya, there isn't really any controversy at all. You see, both these temples have been destroyed several times. In the Islamic conquest of the Gangetic Plain in 1192-94, all the temples in Varanasi were razed. And similarly, Mathura, already in about 1000 by Mahmud Ghaznavi, the whole thing was destroyed. This is all very well documented. And then later Aurangzeb destroyed it again.
So do you think
And,
there is
so there is absolutely no question about that. So then you can still argue about, what should be the modern policy, but at least the historical basis is undisputed.
there is a chance of peaceful transfer of land? Do you see that happening?
Well, it is certainly possible. I've just 3 days ago visited the Kashi Vishwanath myself.
So you saw the corridor being built?
Exactly.
I want to ask a question on that also.
It was a very muddy affair.
Hmm.
And so, I don't know.
How do you
it
see
was
that?
certainly not a very religious atmosphere, I mean,
No,
right now,
now-
a lot of security and so on.
Of course.
But it was not the Kashi Vishwanath at its best. Now, about the details of what the government is doing there, I'm not entirely sure yet. I'm collecting the information.
How do you see this whole, there are accusations of Kyoto-isation project to, change the character of Varanasi, whether that character that was there, some people say that, itna ganda pan tha, wahan pe galiyan choti choti thi. So you have to improve that city to make it attractive for people to at least come there.
Yeah, well, you have this horrible concept of tourism.
Yeah. So
You see, these
these issues keep coming up. So
These
what do you think?
places are not for tourists. You see, these
Yeah.
places are for people who take them seriously as a center of spirituality or as a center of knowledge. There are good enough reasons
at least
to go
it should
to
be
Varanasi.
a pleasant experience. Right?
Yes, okay, fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, the dilapidated structures that existed, maybe they were the best, maybe they were exactly fit for the site. I don't know about this development. We will have to see the result. You see, in the case of Ayodhya, there's a lot of development going on at the site right now. And I mean, on paper, it's quite impressive. I wonder what the experience is going to be.
True.
So, development is something you can't entirely stop, but you can steer it.
Yes.
And
around the character of the city.
Right. And so there I am a bit concerned. I don't see in the BJP the great minds who can be loyal to the original purpose of these sacred places and at the same time reform them, develop them, and so on in a modern, pleasant, and so on way, but respectful of their traditional purpose. I'm not too sure of that. I don't trust the BJP, I must say.
The elephant in the room we have not addressed, because that is the one thing that comes up whenever the Hindutva or Hinduism question is there, the question of Islam. I mean, I don't want to talk about the theological aspects because it's very, I think you said once that it's very boring because it's very clear.
Yeah, it's very simple.
Yeah. So the question really is to how to tackle that problem and that we face.
Yeah, well,
like how to coexist without the two nation theory or another partition, and because it's the same debates that were there in 100 years back. We are facing the same thing again and again.
Yeah, well, in about 1990, I wrote an article in Dutch called De dreiging van de islam, so the threat of Islam. And that's a very typical title for the whole wave of suspicion of Islam, now also in Europe, but well known in India. But in fact, my message in there was not all that typical, because I noticed that the Islamic world is not just expanding, both demographically and institutionally, but it's also being hollowed out from the inside. And you don't notice it much in the sort of critical places, the places in the news, but it is happening. In Europe you see, Islam is gaining strength. At the same time, there are many ex-Muslims. At the time of the Rushdie affair, 32 years ago, Rushdie was strongly supported by many leftist intellectuals who were not yet pro-Islamic. But he was not supported by ex-Muslims because they were nowhere to be seen. Today, in Europe, in every country, you have a society of ex-Muslims. But all the leftist intellectuals are now pro-Islam.
Yes.
And so that's a very interesting shift. But so the ones I want to talk about are the ex-Muslims. Now, this is a phenomenon you also see in the Arab world. You see, most in progressive countries, Tunisia, Lebanon, but even in Saudi Arabia, you see, you have more and more people doubting Islam. And this becomes very easy. In the 90s, 80s, you had books like by Sitaram Goel, critically assessing, you see, what is prophethood, what has Islam done, and so on. And these books are hard to find. And also, you see, as a Muslim youngster in a Muslim family, bringing them home was a real risk. And so on. Today, you see, you can access this all
Online.
privately online. All these facts about Islam are available. There are specialized websites and so on. So you see a growing consciousness of the problems with Islam among Muslims. And so this takes two forms. One is many apostates. Then there are also many, Muslims who are, Muslim in name only, just as there are Hindus in name only. People like the former president, Abdul Kalam, whom, Muslims themselves said, but he's really a Hindu with a Muslim name. And so, you get people who do not officially or formally break with Islam, but essentially grow away from it. So
policy-wise, what should be the strategy of?
Well, let's first still stick with the analysis of what the situation is.
Yeah.
You see, Islam is growing also demographically. That remains. The birth rate among Muslims is coming down like among everyone else, but is always higher than the Hindu one, than the comparable Hindu one in the same class of society, at the same year, and so on. There is always more Muslims than Hindus being born. Like a recent figure I read for Kerala was that 26% of Keralites are Muslims, but 42% of the newborn babies. Right? So that gives an idea of how fast this is going. Why? Because the very literate Keralite people, both Hindus and Christians, loyally practice birth control and so on, and Muslims don't. So this demographic development is very much there, and alarmists are right when they say, okay, before the end of the century, there is going to be a Muslim majority, both in Europe and in India. And so that's mathematically certain, and yet I don't think it's going to happen. Why? Because the nature of these people is changing. You see, how Muslim are they?
I think quite strong.
Well, you see, in India you have a situation of polarization that you don't have in these aforementioned Arab countries. And so that makes Muslims stand together more and feeling pressure that they shouldn't break this loyalty because their community is in this confrontation. So here it goes slower, but I think eventually it's going to happen also.
So any policy recommendations?
Well, you see, some people expect a lot of a population policy. That, I think, at any rate, is a
disaster in making.
Is a no. Well, a disaster, I don't know. It's certainly asking for trouble because many Muslims are going to protest. The international community is going to say, "Oh, the human rights."
The falling rate may actually go up.
Compare with the situation of the Uyghurs. Yes, the falling rate may go up. Like, for instance, The Palestinians still have a very high birth rate because they are in a constant situation of confrontation with the Jews. So that may even happen. At any rate, it won't work because laws in India don't work. You see, they work for Hindus. Hindus will abide by them, and the police will persecute or prosecute Hindus if they don't comply. But the minorities will not be touched.
Yeah.
In fact, like compared to China, you see, in China, you can't make fun of the law. And they're very serious about it, draconically serious about it. Now, for instance, they are against both Islam and Christianity. And yet, you see, the Islamic presence is growing, even if the nature of Islam is being controlled. Like they have censored versions of the Quran, for example.
Yeah.
They are against conversions to Christianity, yet, you know, American Protestants boast that China is becoming the biggest Christian country in the world. And so there are lots of conversions in spite of the law. Now, you see, if this can happen in China, imagine what will happen in India. In India, the law is a joke, or laws are passed but never implemented. Like there are anti-conversion laws in a few states. Have they stopped any conversions? I'm not aware of it. So don't waste your energy on that. You see, this population control is nonsense. I mean, in the situation in India, you may reasonably say, okay, people with more than 2 children do not have access to public posts or so. Okay, fine. But really, you know, really intervening, really preventing births from happening, that's nonsense.
Yeah.
I don't think it's desirable, but at any rate, it's not viable.
Yeah.
And then otherwise, well, you just simply have to create a secular state. I'm not saying a Hindu Rashtra. You call it a Hindu Rashtra if you want, but what you need in the structures is a secular state, everybody equal before the law, no nonsense, no special colleges for Muslims or... you see, of course, no separate family law for Muslims also. I mean, in the long run, this common civil code should become a fact, though I don't think it's a job for Hindus, it's a job for secularists if they take their secular slogan seriously. But so you should just have a normal state, and then, you see, if you think it is worth promoting Hinduism, well, then civil society will have to do that. You see, I remember I also just visited the Sankat Mochan temple in Varanasi, the Hanuman temple, one of the most important ones. It was run by right now the son I haven't met yet, but his father, Veerbhadra Mishra, was an engineering professor, but also very much a devout Hindu. And in some 10 years ago, there was a terrorist attack on the temple with a number of people killed. So he came on TV pleading, you see, with Hindus not to take revenge. Now, you see, I used to know this man because 30 years ago, I was his tenant. He was my landlord. And usually often I went to events that he organized. And so he said that the idea of the state supporting a religion is a very bad idea. Which, in fact, me as a citizen from Belgium, where the Catholic Church used to receive a lot of state support and nevertheless crumbled anyway, would confirm. So he said, people who are supported by the state will become weak. And so I see that throughout history, Hinduism has persisted on its own steam. And so I think that, of course, should be the case now. In this respect, you should learn from the Christian missionaries. You see, many people who convert to Christianity think they have come on a gravy train, you know. Rice Christians who think, oh, from now on all the goodies are coming in from America. And so the missionaries themselves have this strategic principle, well, you see, initially that may be how you lure people, but then you have to make them committed Christians. And so you have to make them do things themselves. If they build a church, it should not be American money that comes in to build the church.
Yeah.
They themselves should gather the funds for building the church. Maybe even like the Sikhs do, you say, build it yourself. Everybody contributes some bricklaying. So you see that idea of a church being self-reliant, that is a good idea. And so similarly, temples should be self-reliant. And of course, without government interference, that's a different discussion. But obviously, I am in favor of the self-government of these temples. So you see, Hinduism should largely build itself. It should, of course, stop the situation where Hinduism is discriminated against, where you can't teach the Mahabharata in schools. That should stop. But apart from that, you see, government should not interfere too much.
I think what's happening in schools is that wearing bangles or using bindi, even those kind of kids are being discriminated against. They are being told to not do that. So that is where the secularization whole thing is going.
And what has the BJP government done about it?
Of course, nothing.
Right.
Just like on temple control, just like on minority scholarships or discrimination in the Right to Education Act.
Yes, so what they have done is they have bought into the secularist narrative.
So this is, they have this, and if we ask the BJP guys, they will say, "Arey, Hindutva was all about, Ram temple ho gaya, that is done, and we have abrogated the Article 370, amended it, so that is done. So our original Hindutva agenda is mostly over. So what do you think the new or the expanded Hindutva agenda the 21st century should be for the BJP?
Well, I know through a privileged source that shortly after the fall of the Vajpayee government, Arun Jaitley interacted with the American ambassador. And you see in the West there is this idea of Hindu fanatics, Hindu fundamentalists and so on. And so he asked, he said, yeah, but can we trust the BJP? Are they not fanatics? And then Arun Jaitley answered that, well, see, this whole Hindutva thing is just for getting votes, you see. After that, we get on with the business of modern government.
I think that video also came out or something like that.
So, well, not that privileged in that case, but at any rate,
I think there was something on social media regarding that. Yeah.
And anyway, I mean, I'm not even just sure about that incident. I'm sure about that attitude in the entire upper ranks of the BJP. And so the conduct of the present government is proof of it every day. So if things happen like that, children are discriminated against because of wearing bindi, that's terrible.
I mean, look at the firecracker issue, for example.
Yes.
BJP has been found stumbling on it. They're found sleeping on the thing. I mean, the former health minister even supported faithfully that firecrackers should be banned, even when there is a complete evidence that firecrackers don't contribute to the pollution load. So, and the stubble burning, they are ignoring that. So, Jallikattu, for example, DMK grabbed that and took the issue. BJP could have done that, but they did not protect it. Even in Sabrimala, they, initially they stumbled. Then they came back to their senses. The inaction of the BJP is ruffling many feathers, at least on social media. I don't know what's happening on the ground, because there is so much symbolism that people get satisfied with, right?
Yeah. So that lacklusterness of the BJP regarding Hindu issues that is starting to worry very many Hindus.
Yeah.
In fact, the contrast between the victory of the communal BJP in Assam versus the secular BJP in Himachal, or the communal BJP a few months ago in West Bengal that won versus the, I mean, they didn't win the majority, but they broke through enormously in a state where they hadn't been present,
True.
versus the complete defeat just now in the by-elections when they had shown their secular face. You know, that ought to teach the BJP that there really are votes in some kind of Hindu activism. And maybe that's the only language they understand.
Maybe it is a 3D chess or some big move that you make people so angry. There's a contrast between Modi and Yogi now, for example.
Yeah.
Similarly, when the Modi was rising, he was considered as Hindu Hriday Samrat, and Advani was like this weakling who was praising Jinnah and whatnot. Similarly, now you see Modi's softening has been softened a lot, and maybe it's a calculated strategy that in-house you have created this. You have Yogi Adityanath, who is seen as next Hindu Hriday Samrat. So you have contrast. So people say, "No, not Modi, but Yogi." But at least you remain in the BJP, right?
Yeah,
the voter. So maybe that is the strategy.
Yeah, when those people speak of strategy, I'm very skeptical. But a strategy in electoral terms, no, that they are good at.
Yeah. Definitely. Dr. Elst, thank you so much. I think there is a lot that we need to discuss and talk about, but given that you have to leave for your hometown today itself actually, and you have to go for another recording. So we wish you best. Travel safe, and thank you so much for giving so much time to us. Thank you so much. Namaste.
फिर मिलेंगे.
जी बिल्कुल.